Do appreciate the attendance of everyone this evening. And as was announced, this will be part 2 of our series of how to study the Bible. And I might mention to you that we indeed were able to get a video recording of part 1. And if you would like to see that, it is on YouTube. If you just Google how to study the Bible and put the word Stan Crowley there, then you should be able to come up with that. And again, I appreciate the interest in so many of you in a series of lessons on how to study the Bible. And I'm trying to be true to the guidance that I was given. Those who asked for it said, don't give us the theory, Stan. Tell us what you actually do. What do you actually do when you study the Bible? And so I've tried to do that. And at the beginning I said, maybe this is kind of my journey. If there are some things that you hear that you say, well, that wouldn't be exactly the way I would do it, that's fine. If you find a thing or 2 or 3 that's useful out of this, then glad to have the opportunity to do it. So, study. I want to remind you just of a couple of things we said at the beginning. What is studying? Studying is not just reading. It's not just memorizing. If you want to sit down and read your Bible in a devotional kind of way or an overview kind of way, that's certainly great. Studying is more than that. It requires more intensity. It requires more effort than that. One person defines it, says studying requires it's an active and reactive process. You're reading things, you're looking, you're thinking about the things that you're seeing, you're thinking about the other things that are associated with them. And I thought it was kind of an interesting guideline. One person says at the time that you're sitting there at your desk, probably less than half is actually reading. So that gives you kind of a proportion of the amount of time that you are looking at other things. Somebody told me they were studying a passage and they never got through the passage. They found this was interesting. They went and studied more about that. They found this was interesting. They went and studied more about that. They never got through the passage they were trying to study. And I said, great. That's it. That's the way it should work. You should be following your interest. But of all the definitions of studying, the one that's most helpful to me was by Earl West, connecting. Connecting what you're reading, connecting what you're hearing with something you've already learned. And I think that the more I look back at what I did, I think that you'll see as I explain to you some of the things that I did, I was making connections. I think that part I was doing correctly. So you must identify information, you must connect information. So studying, if you want a definition, involves actively connecting what you read with facts or principles that you already know. And of course, in the studying process, you want to be learning new things. You may want to be remembering new bits of information. But as the red circle at the top or the red oval, identify information. You've got to understand what a passage is about. You've got to have an info bite there. And then what you want to do is learn how to connect those bits of information together. I gave you some examples. One way you connect information with notes. I showed you a page out of my old Bible, where in the beginning of Colossians chapter 3, it talks about risen with Christ. What does that mean? You begin looking backwards into chapter 2. Get to 2:12. Buried with Christ in baptism, in which you're risen with Him. And I showed you my very crude way of making a connection. I just drew a pencil line. Circled the words and drew a pencil line between them. Now, all the connections that we want to make are not necessarily on the same page like that was. I gave you another example. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, talks about an old law and a new law. And one's been done away, and one is the one that brings salvation. Now, what are they talking about here? What is the writer of Hebrews talking about? Well, I pointed out, if you look back in chapter 8, you find out what that first law is. It's the law that the Israelites got when they came out of the land of Egypt. You look at chapter 9, you find out what the new law is. It's the new covenant that came into effect with the death of Jesus Christ. So, if we're reading things in order, we would have been through 8, we would have known what the first covenant was. We would have been through 9, we would have known what the second covenant was. When we got to 10, to understand that one's been done away. Now, what do you do with this information? I believe you take the time to make the connections. In Hebrews 10, 9 and 10, you write, Hebrews 8, 7 and 9, Hebrews 9, 15 and 17. In the margin, somewhere, you circle, you make a note. So that next time you come across that, you won't say, now, what was that? Where was it I learned about that? It's right there. One advantage of taking notes is hopefully it saves you time. You don't have to retrace those exploratory steps that you did once before. And then I said what I would do is I would also go back to Hebrews 8 and make the note about Hebrews 10. I'd go back to Hebrews 9 and make the note about Hebrews 10. Connecting. bits of information that are significant to one another, somehow connecting them so you can find them again. At some point, certainly in this series, I want to talk about how it is that you understand the verse. How do you understand the words? How do you understand the context? How do you understand the phrases? How do you understand the subject? I want to spend a couple of lessons on that. But for this week, I think there's one other important general thing that we need to talk about before we begin to talk just about the individual verses. And I guess the overall theme of the rest of this lesson really is organization. I mean, if you have all these pieces of information but you can't find them, if you have them all but you can't get them all together so you can use them to increase your knowledge of a particular subject, then the info bites are not useful unless you have a way of getting them together. There was this quote that says, learning is always easier if you organize the material in some way, rather than putting it in your mind as a mass of disorganized items. There are enough disorganized things in my mind already. I don't want my Bible study to be that way. Organization. And if you're organizing it, what are you doing? Well, you're collecting bits of information and you're associating them with one another in some way. So organization shows the relationships, the connections between the bits of information. Remember what we're doing here. We're trying to identify bits of information, significant facts, items, principles, and we're trying to connect them. So how do you organize? Well, I started looking at the different ways that I have organized, and maybe more so than I did back at the time, really, these different ways of organizing things are making connections. Now, you have your handout there. I didn't try to put every slide on the handout, but this one is there. They're lists, they're groups, they're summaries, outlines, timelines, charts, diagrams. And time permitting, I plan to try to give you an example of each one of these. Really, last time I gave you the example of lists. I told you that when I found a topic that was of some interest to me, I would take one of those blank pages in the back of the Bible and I would list the topic like civil law, obedience to civil law. And then when I was reading and I found a verse that was on that topic, I'd make a list of the verse underneath that topic in the back of the Bible. Romans 13, be subject to the higher powers. 1 Peter, be subject to the ordinances. 2 Peter and Jude, respect dignitaries. All of these things. Another example was like-mindedness. I decided that was significant. Now, I meant to say last time, somebody might say, oh, Stan, I can put this in a notebook. That's great. If a notebook works for you, that's fine. But at that time in particular, I was a lot of different places at a lot of different times. To me, I had that Bible right there in my pocket. So blank pages on the back of the Bible. The back of the Bible. That's what worked for me in terms of making lists. You want something that works. Many times in my life, I imagine, I envision something that's grandiose and complete and thorough, and it never happens. It's better to have a small success than a big failure. You can take that notebook and you can label every page with a different topic. But if you don't have that notebook with you every time you're studying, you're not going to have access to the information that's in it. You're not going to be recording more information. So above all, find something that's practical. So one way I did was I was making lists. These are topical associations of different passages with one another. And I almost didn't mention this, but the more I thought about it, this is one thing that I did that really, really helped me. I began to accumulate more library books. Back in the maybe late 70s, early 80s, I was aggressively trying to build a good library. And I would take the books off the shelf and I would use them, and I would come back later and Carol had straightened up my office, straightened up my desk, and I couldn't find those books anymore. She put them away. So, with a friend of mine, we worked for months on a good organizational scheme, topical organizational scheme. And it's got about 3 different levels of hierarchy to it. I just kind of gave you some examples out of the top level. But this would work. If you have some library books, let these top-level topics sort of be the labels on your shelf. Bible history, you need some place to organize things that are involved in Bible history. Christian living, the church, deity, Godhead, doctrinal defense. apologetics, evolution versus creation, those things that you run into, you need a place to put them. General doctrines, you always need a catch-all category. Every good list, every good budget needs to have a miscellaneous. That was kind of my miscellaneous. Morality and ethics, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Christian purity of the young and the old. A lot of things are very relevant to our lives are in that category. Religious sects. There's times we gather information about what other people believe. We need to know what they believe from their literature so we'll be able to talk to them. Salvation. Big topic. Probably could have included it someplace else in the breakdown. But to me that was so important I ought to add it on a separate category. Now, these work fine. As you build more information, you can expand the list. And you might notice here it says library books and file cabinets. When I developed this breakdown, or when we developed it, not only did I group my books in this way on the shelves, I got a file cabinet. And I labeled folders with each of these. So when I was reading an article in the Gospel Advocate back then, or the Firm Foundation, I thought, oh, that's a good article. I'd make a copy of it, put it in the file folder. Heard a sermon that I like, asked for a copy, put it in the file folder. So, what would happen when I was ready to study a topic? I go to if I want to study something about, morality, I go to my library. Boom, all the books are together. I put those on my desk. I go to my file cabinet. I have a file folder with all the topics, all the papers I've collected on that topic. Put that on my desk. A lot of time spent in studying is gathering the information together. This, I believe, will greatly help you. Now, these things, you can break them down. Christian living is a very, very big topic. And it may be that as you accumulate articles, you say, well, I've got 2 inches of articles on Christian living. I need some way to sort them out. Well, we had that in our list. Christian living, we divided into Christian conduct, Christian home, influencing others. That's a part of Christian living. Sometimes we counsel others. Sometimes we try to lead others. Relationship with others. Spiritual development, I put on this Christian living. What are the things that we do to try to help us grow spiritually? So I had a kind of a place for everything. So it wasn't just a bunch of disorganized information. Now today, maybe rather than a physical filing cabinet, maybe on your flash drive you have a bunch of file folders. You find an article that you like, you save a copy, you put it in there. If you find a printed article that you like, you scan a PDF of it and you drop it in there. But this can certainly be adapted. But this is the kind of topical organization I'll use both for my books and for the material I had in those file cabinets. Now, I recognize there was another part of books, and that is reference books. The atlases, the commentaries, dictionaries, encyclopedias, surveys, and handbooks. So this was different. This was just reference books, library books only. But you need to have that section on your shelf there for the dictionaries, the encyclopedias, whatever it will be. Concordances and topical works. I just want to mention, those are really valuable. There is one in particular that I've used for eons. It's called the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge. Treasury of Scripture Knowledge. I have it in printed form. From the earliest versions of the Bible that were available online, it was one of the things that was included in there. Treasury of Scripture Knowledge. There's an app now. You go to your Android Play Store. There's an app. Treasury of Scripture Knowledge. Linking topical things together. I still maintain that the links that you make for yourself are much more valuable because they're yours. Sometimes you can get some good starts off of other people's material. So one way to organize is in subject groups. Another way to organize is summaries. Now here's what I mean by that. The book of Genesis. I found these in several places. One of them was walk through the Bible or talk through the Bible. Sometimes you'll find these kinds of things really in several different places. I don't know how they work out the copyright infringement, but you'll find exactly the same thing in several different books. And one thing you want to do is, when you get information and you copy it exactly, put a note on the piece of paper where you got it from. You may want to use it in an article you submit, and you need to have a reference. I've always tried to keep good records of where I got things. But the book of Genesis, you can remember the book of Genesis as 4 events and 4 people. How simple is that? The 4 events are the creation, the fall, the flood, the scattering. The four people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So, you're wanting to study the book of Genesis, you're studying a particular part of the book of Genesis, you want to know what the context is, there it is. 4 events, 4 people. Now, this may be one of the things I'm about to tell you now that you want to throw this away. You don't want to use this. I've talked to people before that thought that this was kind of beneath their dignity. But sometimes if I really want to remember something, I try to come up with a little mnemonic scheme for it. Sometimes I'll make an acrostic out of the letters, and I'll remember just the beginning letters. I'll make a word out of the beginning letters. Sometimes I'll draw a little picture that represents it. For example, the 4 events, the creation, the fall, the flood, and the scattering. Suppose that in your mind you picture the Garden of Eden and the leaves on the trees in the Garden of Eden are falling. They're falling into some waters that are flooding and flowing and are scattering those leaves all over the place. So you've got the leaves that represent the creation. You've got the fall, the leaves are falling. You've got the flood waters, that represents the flood. And then you got the scattering. Not only can you remember that, I defy you to forget that. So I spent some time, not for everything, once in a while. The book of Exodus, liberation, legislation. I just like the simplicity of that. The preparation of Moses, the plagues, the Passover, passage to Sinai. On the other, liberation. First part's about the liberation. Last part's about the legislation. Summaries. They've helped me greatly kind of get a grasp of things. One more, book of Judges, living with the Canaanites. Why were they living with the Canaanites? Because they failed to drive them all out. That's why they were living with the Canaanites. Then they were at war with the Canaanites. They went through those cycles that people typically went through. And then in the end, living like the Canaanites. Intermarrying with the people, adopting their idolatrous practices. So, again, there are a lot of different sources for these things. Pick and choose the ones that make the most sense to you. You don't have to take one particular author and use everything that he's got. It's wonderful today. There are lots of different alternatives. One way to organize summaries of information. Another way to organize is outlines. And over the years, I've taught many books of the Bible. I have to outline a book before I can teach it. If I don't have some concept of the flow of information, how it's going, what the major bits of information are, and how they flow together, I don't know how to teach a book. I don't know how to teach a passage if I don't understand something about the context. The book of 1 John. Now, you don't have to spend the time to get them all to start with the same letter. But this is an example, I did that. The proof of the incarnation, 1 John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Became flesh and dwelt among us. The path of light. How much about John is about light? Power of knowledge. Profitability of righteous living, the prescription of love prevailing through the faith, not just belief, but the faith. Now, of course, sometimes there's more detail, and you can expand it in greater detail. For example, the profitability of righteous living, what does it do? It provides sonship. You can be a child of God. It precludes continual sinning. The one who's a child of God is not in a constant process of sin. It promotes love of the brethren, permits a good conscience. Identifying bits of information. Now, you say, well, I never was very good at outlining. I never liked outlining in school. I don't really want to do that. Okay, fine. But if you can't look at the parts of a book or the parts of a chapter and kind of see what each part is about, if you can't identify sort of the topic of that bit of information, and you can't connect it to the information bits around it, I think you're going to have a hard time understanding the book. So, one of the things that I did was I did a lot of outlining. And it's not always easy. You get to the book of Hebrews, it is not easy to outline it. It's one of the books where the changes in topics don't necessarily occur at the chapter divisions. It's tough. But I found somebody who did a good job, and I thought, I can see that. I had trouble with Romans, the overall flow of Romans. I was supposed to teach a class in Romans, and I I just couldn't figure out how all the info bytes fit together. So I'll tell you what I did. I started at the end of the book. And I thought, okay, what's the final conclusion that Paul is making here? Okay, got it. How does he set that up? Oh, I could see where he set that conclusion up. Well, how does he set up that conclusion? I worked my way from the back to the front, and when I got back to the front, I could see the flow. Study. It's studying. It's not casual reading. Do you really want to study the Bible? You can wind up perhaps doing some of these same things. You may not start out there, but the further you get into it, you may wind up there. And it occurred to me that, I'm kind of telling you my whole journey. Some of these things are back in the 80s. I'm telling you in a few minutes. And maybe some of the things that I finally got to at the end of the journey made more sense to me at the end than they would have in the beginning. So if there's some things you think, well, I don't know if I really want to do that, that's fine. Take the things that are useful to you, put the other things on the shelf. It may be as you get further into your journey, you may say, oh, now I see why he was doing that. As you get further on. One way to organize information is timelines and chronology. And you may have to look at your handout, and it's not crystal clear on your handout. It's the general flow of history, from Adam, and then there's Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and they went down in the land of Egypt, and they came out in the northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Now, you've seen this chart. You've seen this chart many times. It didn't look like that. It looked like this. It was on the back room, the classroom back there. Because if you're studying the Old Testament, it may indeed be helpful. And again, I'm not here to teach the chart. I'm just to show you the way to organize information. Let me just remind you how I got there, just very briefly. There's a red region and a green and a yellow. Green is the Canaan land flowing with milk and honey, the lush land. This is colored this way because it matches the sand of Egypt. This was just red because that was another good color. Maybe it's an appropriate color. Vicious nations up in that. That's the Syrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Probably a lot of bloodshed. But anyhow, it kind of started with that general concept, and then just sort of let that north be the red, and then, Canaan and Egypt, and then began to put the timeline on there up in the northern region, Adam and then Noah and Abraham made his journey into Egypt, came back to the promised land. And you can kind of see you got geography going up and down and chronology left and right, and so ultimately you wind up with this. Goes through the division of the kingdom of the north. They were carried away. They were distributed by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom lasted longer, carried away by the Babylonians. Then when the Persians took over, they were allowed to return. They were back. The promised people were back in the promised land when Jesus was born, lived, and died. Over here, that's a DJ. It's the destruction of Jerusalem. Don't read about it in the Bible, but in Matthew chapter 4, you read a lot of detailed information about it. Extremely significant. So this is the chart, but it didn't start out that way. It started out like this. And I might just call your attention to a couple of little blocks. You see the little block right there in red? Let me expand that. Well, that's my notes. You see, on my journey to studying the Bible, I left myself some breadcrumbs along the way. Later, if I thought, why did I put that at that date? Well, I gave myself some notes. My conclusion, by the way, when I did the arithmetic, was Abraham was born in 1952 BC. And when I began to look at other people, there's some others that come up with exactly the right date. Exactly the same date. Which would make it, no. 1877 promises to Abraham. But you see, here's the arithmetic. Here's Galatians 3:17, Exodus 12, 40 through 41. If you want to sort this out, my suggestion is you look at Exodus 12:40. Look at Adam Clark's commentary. Got a good explanation of that. But anyhow, there's some of my breadcrumbs. On my final chart, which I've kept all these years, I put notes on there. So I can figure out what was going on. Now, on the right-hand side, I'm going to blow that up. You see on this chart, and you don't see it on the big color chart, but here are the names of the prophets. Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Obadiah. They're here, and there are some that are further up here. In trying to understand the flow of history, I wanted to know where these minor prophets were. Which ones were to the north, so I put them in the north. Which ones were to the south, I put them down in the south. Just my way of organizing information so that if I was trying to understand the context of something, I was better able to do that. Now, again, you haven't seen that in that form, but you saw this chart just a few months ago in this form. the introduction to the minor prophets. There it is. There's the historical flow. Here are the prophets, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, prophets, the surrounding nations. I put the major prophets on there. So, that gathering of information that I did back in the mid-'80s, it has been helpful to me on many occasions. In teaching classes of the overview of the Old Testament and introduction of the minor prophets. So, again, started out like that. And one other thing, on the bottom of the chart, the one that you have, you see this line down here? It's Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd. Those are the storyline books of the Old Testament. People want to read the Old Testament, and they read Genesis. Oh, nice story. Understand it. Nice flow of events, nice narrative. Exodus, same thing. Leviticus, what's that all about? Deuteronomy, what's all that about? If you want to read the narrative flow of events in the Old Testament, these are the books. And I put those right there. I put them on a big chart down here on the bottom. And here's an expanded view of that. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st. What about 1st and 2nd Chronicles? They really parallel some of this. It's duplicated information. Then Ezra and Nehemiah for the very last days. You want to read the flow? That's the overall flow. So I put that on the big chart also. I like to get a lot of stuff in one place, then I carry a copy of that with me, and I have a lot of this stuff. Now, you can do the same thing in the New Testament. In fact, it is, really, really helpful there. Let me start with just kind of some basic timelines. 80, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. If you want to remember what they are, I have a system that everything is a CC. Christian chronology, or Crowley's chronology. 80-30, crucifixion of Christ. 80-40, conversion of Cornelius. 80-50, the council on circumcision. 80-60, you may not have noticed it so much, that's the change of procurators, Felix and Festus. And 87, the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, is that important? Well, 80-30, Peter stands up on Pentecost and says the gospel's for all. 10 years later, it takes a special vision to Peter to get him to go to the household of that Gentile Cornelius. 10 years later, they were still grasping with whether the gospel really was for all. And what was that council on circumcision about in AD 50? Still had to do with the acceptability of the Gentiles. If you don't get things in some sort of kind of chronological spread, you miss a lot of the connections. You miss a lot of the significance. By the way, AD 50 is Acts 15. AD 50 is Acts 15. Acts chapter 2 is AD 30, as you know. A couple of big points there. So, what I wanted to mention was life of Paul. I learned a long time ago from one of the elders back in Virginia. When you study Acts, study Paul's letters also. The integration of the history in Acts with the informations in the letters, if you blend those together, you get fivefold at least better understanding of what's going on. I just pointed out here, Paul was probably born, I can explain to you, why I think that, probably about the same time as Jesus. Became a Christian in the mid-30s. First 35 years of his life, he lived as a Jew. Last 35, he lived as a Gentile. His life, he died about AD 68. His life is split in two parts, half as Jew, half as a Gentile. And I like to just point out, Paul had a lot of journeys to preach the gospel before he made what we call the first missionary journey. In fact, if you look at it, I think he spent more years in journeying before the first missionary journey than he did after that. And I don't want to talk in detail all about that. And he spent the time in prison, his later travels, he was in prison again, there's his death. The period of Paul's writings were about from AD 52 to about AD 68. So really, he only wrote mostly during the last half of the time he was a Christian. So you want a perspective on the life of Paul? Half of his life as a Jew, half of his life as a Gentile, a lot of travels, but really on the last half, in the last half of his life as a Christian, did he do his writings. And let me just do this one, and I guess we'll have to conclude. If you take that and kind of blow it up, during the first journey, you wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 50 AD, 52 and 53. Now, there's some people who have different dates for those. These are my conclusions. Next journey, you wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, you wrote Romans. And the prison epistles, we're pretty confident about that. Ephesians, Philippians, Philemon, Colossians. And then these later journeys. How do we know these are different journeys? Because he says, I'm here and going to there. And that bit of geography does not fit any of his other journeys. So he's clearly talking about journeys that are not the other journeys, the first, second, and third journey, because we have pretty detailed records of those. Some of the connections you can make. But I want you to notice here, kind of in conclusion, is when you group these letters of Paul chronologically, they also grouped topically. First letters that he wrote, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, were about the last things, about the resurrection of the dead, about the return of Christ. Those two are linked. The center set of epistles there were about salvation. Romans 1:16, and I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, it's the power of God of salvation. Galatians, about the freedom that comes through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Those epistles he wrote in prison about Christ. Christ is the fullness of all things. He's the supremacy of all things. He is the head of the church. The church is his body. So much about Christ. And then about the church. 1 Timothy, Titus, well, what do we find there? We find the qualifications of those who will serve as elders in the church. We find the organization of the church. Interestingly enough, when you get to chronology, things also break out topically. So, the last chart, I gave you a diagram. You have a copy of that there. I've used that on other occasions. So, again, organizing the information, the ability to recall it later, extremely important. But all the study is in vain if we don't have the willingness, the goodness of heart to obey the things that we've learned. And what do we learn? Well, we learn about salvation in a number of books. How the salvation is available through Jesus Christ, we need to follow Jesus Christ and his apostles. We need to believe in God, believe in Christ. We need to have that change of heart, that change of will called repentance. Be willing to confess Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, and then be baptized for forgiveness of sins. And if we can help you in any of those acts of obedience, we will be glad to have that opportunity if you'll come forward.